Well, good morning. We're back. Welcome to the Energy Futures Town Hall. I am Stuart Muir. I'm the CEO of Resource Works, and I'm joined by Barry Penner, who's the chair of the Energy Futures Institute. And today's topic on this webinar is local government at the crossroads of affordability and transition. This is the third in our series in 2024. And we welcome you, whether you're returning or it's your first time, second time, or third time. I would like to say a special thank you to the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade and members of the Regional Transportation and Infrastructure Committee who are watching this in the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade boardroom. Welcome. And anyone else who is new to it, welcome to you. We have a format we pursued. I'm going to tell you quickly about what's on the slate for today and how it works and how you can plug in. So I'll just break down what we're going to be discussing as Barry takes over in a moment to go through his presentation. BC energy consumption, challenges facing British Columbia energy and energy deficit, electricity, of course, the roadmap to 2030 in BC, the issue of the natural gas bans we're seeing at the municipal level in some areas of British Columbia, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So it'll be about half presentation, half Q&A, which is where you come in, and where if you look to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see that there's Q&A there. That's it's real easy to contribute to a Q&A, and you can also use the chat if there's something you want to communicate to us organizers. There's an easy way to do that. So these tools are super easy to use. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. We're using them to keep this dynamic. We want your questions, and we will be sharing the presentation with you afterward. There's a lot of detail in it. Barry's done a tremendous job in telling this story. So with no further ado, Barry, it's over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Stuart, and good morning from me to everyone as well. And thank you for your time and your interest in this topic. Just wanted to start with a high-level overview. In British Columbia, we tend to spend a lot of our time talking about electricity, and it can lead you to think that that's the dominant energy source that we depend on. But this slide is really just meant to put things in context, and you can see that between BC Hydro, Fortis, and a few other smaller utilities at the municipal level, electricity combined represents about 17% of the energy that's actually consumed in British Columbia. The rest, 83%, comes from a variety of other sources, refined petroleum products being the first one and the largest overall single source of energy that we depend on. That's for diesel, natural gasoline, and things to propel us around the province. Then, of course, you have natural gas and other gas utilities like Pacific, Northern Gas, and other natural gas used for processing of refineries, and then biofuels. So again, just to highlight that electricity itself only gives us about 17% of the energy we need currently to keep our economy moving. And then next slide shows you that on the coldest day of the year, when we have our peak demand for energy to keep us warm, you can see that natural gas provides about double the amount of energy on a peak day that electricity does. So again, just putting in context that electricity is not the dominant source of energy for moving us around the province or for keeping us warm on the coldest day. Next slide. So what's happened in British Columbia is there's been a growing awareness that all is not well because we've become dependent in the last year and a half or two on imported electricity. And combine that with the BC government's very aggressive Clean BC policy of restricting other forms of energy and mandating electric vehicle sales 90% by the 2030 model year, which itself would require 2 Site C dams worth of more electricity. There's a realization that some of these numbers just don't add up. What our ambition is, it doesn't necessarily match what's actually available to us. And we just got a collection of headlines there to illustrate that point. And again, the one on the lower left, Vancouver Island, that applies to all of BC, that climate change is making it more difficult for us to rely on traditional energy sources like hydroelectric because we just don't know if the precipitation patterns will be the same with climate change. Next. Global BC and others, of course, have also followed this issue closely over the last year or so. Next slide. So put this in some detail. BC Hydro itself acknowledged that they're facing an issue with being more dependent on imported electricity. This was an update that they filed with the Utilities Commission back April of 2023. And a couple of months later is when the BC government announced we're going to do a call for power from the private sector, looking for more electricity. And this is what preceded it, was this forecast that we're going to be increasingly dependent on imported electricity. Next slide. And then putting things in context over time, you can see how we've moved from being an exporter, the green box is net exports, to an importer of electricity. I should also just mention that courtesy of these slides were given us a courtesy of Richard Mason, a former commissioner of the BC Utilities Commission. The next slide. And so taking into account the new call for electricity that came out this spring, BC Hydro's projecting that hopefully this will help manage that deficit and maybe reverse it. But again, it's assuming that these projects come online in a timely manner. Unfortunately, what we've seen is permitting delays continue to grow in British Columbia, not just here, across Canada as well, but particularly in British Columbia. It's taking longer and longer to permit things. So at Energy Futures, we have significant concern that even this call for power will get actually put into place in a timely fashion. BC Hydro itself acknowledges that not all the projects are likely to come online until maybe 2032 or 2033. So it's still quite a ways off before we see power produced from these projects, which are still being evaluated. BC Hydro has not actually signed contracts yet for any of these projects that have been put forward. Next slide. And then if BC Hydro were to pursue a more aggressive electrification scenario under direction from the government, then this is what they projected in terms of back to increasing deficits of electricity. If we're going to try to increase the share of electricity dramatically in that overall pie chart that I showed you at the beginning, it puts us back into a deficit position. And again, that's even after the call for power and after Site C dam is fully completed and online. Next slide. And just tell you about the bottom line. This was filed with the Utilities Commission just around the Labor Day weekend. And sorry if my yellow highlighting has made it more difficult to read, but it shows that the cost to BC Hydro of importing that electricity in the last fiscal year came out to close to $1.4 billion. And that's one reason, well, that's the main reason why BC Hydro actually reported a net loss last year. If it wasn't for transferring money from what are called deferral accounts, it's an accounting maneuver. If it wasn't for that, they would have been reporting a loss in the multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. Next slide. The BC government put out a kind of update on energy policy in June in the run-up to the election. It's called Stronger BC for Everyone. And in that document themselves, they acknowledge that there's currently 7,000 megawatts waiting to be demand to be met for new industry in British Columbia. It's in the BC Hydro interconnection queue. If that were all to go ahead, well, you can just imagine what that would do, that previous chart showing us going into a greater and greater deficit of electricity. And just to put in reference, Site C dam, which is starting to come online, one turbine spinning now, but the rest will wait and will come online next year and hopefully be fully online by about this time next year, is 1,100 megawatts. But there's 7,000 megawatts waiting from industry and job creating businesses in BC. So just to put it in context, the scale of the challenge. Next line, this slide. We're not alone. And again, why Energy Futures is concerned about us being in an import situation is that our neighbors are facing similar constraints. And just at the end of last month, major utilities south of the border, you could see Avista, Puget Sound Energy, Pacificor, and others, wrote a letter to their regulators in Washington State expressing concern about their legislation and policies in Washington State. Next slide. which are, of course, those policies are intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is all good, but it's depending on more electricity. And the utilities are combining together to say, just wait a minute, we're facing an unprecedented surge in electricity demand over the next year. Some of those things are data centers, high-tech manufacturing, other electrification trends, again, like electric vehicle mandates, all putting extra strain on the grid as it is. And that's before greater restrictions on the use of natural gas for home heating and commercial heating. Next slide. The utility said that in order to try and square the circle of policy measures aimed at increasing the use of electricity and phasing out fossil fuels, and including natural gas, would require a moonshot level of effort to pull it off. And they say unprecedented action is required. And they're highlighting to their regulator in Washington State what some of the risks are that they're facing, including just failure to maintain reliability. Next slide. So some of the action in Washington State prompted a referendum, what they call an initiative, just a few weeks ago. With the U.S. presidential election, there, of course, there were many elections and voting going on for various measures in the United States. And in Washington State, they have legislation that allows them to have initiatives where citizens can get involved and vote on specific policies. And one that caught our attention was Initiative 2066. And it was a response to legislation passed this spring by the Washington State legislature, which would discourage the use of natural gas for home heating. At the same time, a number of local governments in Washington State were taking steps to change their building codes to also restrict or prohibit the use of natural gas for new construction, for home heating and commercial heating. And this prompted this initiative. And it's one of the very few initiatives that succeeded. As of last report, most of the ballots have been counted, and this initiative has been successful. And what it does is prohibit and overturn essentially that legislation passed by the legislature and local government efforts to try and ban the use of natural gas. Next slide. In British Columbia, we have a different situation at the moment. We have the Clean BC Roadmap, as it's called, which is not just a policy document. There's also been many regulations already and some legislation passed to put various aspects of it in place. Overall, it is our climate plan for BC, calls for a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Currently, our emissions are still at about the level they were in 2007, 2008, when I introduced BC's first climate action plan. So emissions overall haven't really come down in total, but we've been able to keep them flat. But to try and achieve a 40% reduction in the next just over 5 years will be extremely daunting, considering that we're really just where we were in 2008. But one of the components of Clean BC is this idea of a zero carbon, what's called the zero carbon step code. It's really an amendment to the building code. And a number of local governments have decided to, with the encouragement of the province, to get ahead of this plan, which calls for restrictions on the use of natural gas being in place by 2030. So a number of local governments, including Vancouver and Nanaimo and Victoria, Saanich, Richmond, Burnaby, and recently Port Moody, have decided to go faster than what the province is requiring. And I just highlighted here that even in the Clean BC roadmap, if you just go back to that previous slide, the government themselves acknowledge that natural gas is a low-cost energy source for buildings. But despite an affordability crisis, steps are being made to make, as indicated by 2030, to significantly restrict and effectively prohibit the use of natural gas for new construction. Next slide. And this slide just illustrates again some of what I just mentioned about what local governments have been doing. However, in Vancouver, I should point out that council did vote in the summer to revisit this idea of restricting natural gas, citing concerns around affordability and trying to prevent or give people an option, an energy choice, and to have backup power rather than having all your chips in one corner, as it were. with electricity. The next slide. The reliance on heat pumps does raise concern, certainly in various parts of the province. I saw this article last January during the cold snap that we had, when we had record electricity demand, set an all-time high for consumption during the cold weather. And you can see some people were concerned that relying on heat pumps would pose a challenge. Of course, the colder it gets, the more difficult it is for heat pumps to remain efficient in more temperatures around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, or even down to maybe 0. They can be quite effective, but the colder it gets, the more challenging the equation is in terms of the amount of electricity that's required. Regardless of the efficiency, they still will put more demand on the electrical system at peak periods. And it's the peak that utilities must build for. It's not okay to tell your customers, hey, you're going to be okay most of the time. Sorry about the really cold weather. That's when we can't supply you. So they have to build for that maximum peak. And that's what poses so much of a challenge and a cost for utilities, is they have to make sure they can still maintain reliability even during the coldest days. Now, speaking of reliability, something called the National Energy Reliability Corporation issued a report last year. They looked at utilities across North America, and they identified BC Hydro as potentially being at risk by 2026 or 27 for maintaining reliability standards and having adequate reserves to deal with unexpected situations, including unprecedented cold snaps or failures of various parts of the electrical system. And that's the first time that British Columbia has been moved into that category. And one of the reasons cited by this not-for-profit entity that looks at utilities with an unvarnished eye was the Clean BC policies restricting the use of natural gas for electricity generation in BC, and just a number of the other policies that are leading to increased electricity demand here in the province. Next slide. Again, I've mentioned about some of the challenges associated with putting all of your marbles in one place, or all your eggs in one basket. With climate change, it appears that the frequency of significant storms has been increasing over time. You can look back at numbers going back well before 2014. Professor Antweiler at UBC took a look at this and looked at about a 25-year period and saw a pretty consistent trend line that significant storm activity leading to power outages has been on the increase. And that's just something for us to keep in mind. And in more rural parts of the province, it takes longer typically to get electricity restored. Sometimes power outages can last up to 12 hours or more, depending on where you are in British Columbia. Next slide. And here's where the rub is. We all are seeking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions where we can. We're aware of the impact, I've just mentioned it, of climate change and how it's impacting British Columbia. But at the same time, we're facing more than just the climate emergency. We have a housing crisis, and you could say also an affordability crisis. And so that's where I think policymakers have to be careful about trying to balance these various things. We at Energy Futures, and also I've heard Stuart at ResourceWorks refer to this as the energy trilemma, trying to do multiple things at the same time: reliability, affordability, and sustainability. And those three things are sometimes in competition with each other. And as we do all of this, I think it's prudent to just bear in mind, and it's not an argument for not doing our part, but just to recognize that in British Columbia, even if we did reduce all of our emissions today, it would not make a very significant dent in the global emissions picture if we just look at what we're doing within our borders. We represent about 13/100ths of 1 percentage point of global greenhouse gas emissions. Again, not an argument for not doing our part. We need to, but we need to be mindful that within our boundaries, if we just measure what we're doing here, our impact globally is not very big. But there are opportunities, and Stuart, I've heard you talk about them, about how exporting LNG to other places that are using coal, if coal gets displaced by cleaner BC LNG, for example, liquefied natural gas, that can have a bigger reduction to the global climate or global atmosphere in terms of emissions than what we can do just looking within our own provincial boundaries.
Yeah, Barry, if I could lean in on that, knowing as we do that the audience here, if you're here, you're probably a bit of an energy nerd, you're interested. We see the complexity in energy systems and struggle to explain that in public processes. The public is busy, people are doing their thing in their lives. Thinking about energy systems isn't really top of the list, but when you look at the consequences of inattention to what matters, we occasionally have a case study unfolding in real time. And I think City of Vancouver is an example. This is a policy that came in 4 years ago. Let's ban natural gas. That feels good in heating and hot water for new buildings. And lo and behold, reality bites. And this is why I believe the city council and what they stated when the new city council in 2024 said, look, this is not working out. Well, why wasn't it working out? One thing that we've heard, I've seen documents submitted to the Utilities Commission saying, look, in Vancouver, projects with electrical utility connection budgets of $500,000 or $1 million to get that new building, hooked in to the grid, that's what it would have cost. Now, because of banning gas, we're seeing that figure rise to a range of $4 to $10 million for that project. Well, guess what happens? It's not the project gets more expensive or that housing unit gets more expensive. The project doesn't move ahead. So if indeed we are at a time of housing affordability emergency, and I consistently hear that, would it be a good idea to take steps to make housing affordable in the realm of energy that can be controlled? But I think it's important in this public discourse to say, look, if we're restoring energy choice, it's not at the price, and you've referenced this, Barry, of climate commitments. We all want to be going in the right direction. The right direction is less emissions. So how do we balance climate goals with what we're seeing in, we can't build housing, then a number of issues. And in this presentation, Barry, you've covered a huge amount of ground, which is why we're going to make the slide deck available later for anyone who wants to refer to it. But I think in this compressed space, let's just unpack a couple of things. The peaking. I mean, if we've got 2/3 of the energy on the coldest day that comes from gas today, and 1/3 comes from electricity, and it's 2024. Well, what about 2034? In 10 years, will it be very different from that? And how will it be different? Where is the electricity going to come from? But now we're learning that the supply of new electricity that meets the test of emissions intensity or net zero, where's it going to come from? There's a huge supply gap there. And, as they say, we want to see receipts. If we're being served up some claims of how the future will unfold, that's a very different thing than saying, here's what's actually happening right now that our efforts have caused to occur. Those are fundamentally different. And if we're just running this whole energy system on these promises, that's not really the way to reliability. So just a few other points on Vancouver. When you have 98% efficient appliances and they're always getting more efficient, that's pretty good. In the real world, 90%, 98% of anything is very good. So having a direction where reliability, using high efficient equipment, that's always improving, where there's incentives to make investments in it, to change out old. I mean, we've been hearing this for decades. It's never been more important than now. So we can continue to cut. And if you look south of the border, Barry, you talked about Washington State. They're not doing that for no reason. I think the stability of the energy system, the term you see used in that context, don't hear it so much in Canada, but clean, firm power. I mean, reliable, the energy trilemma, it needs to be clean and firm. Is it perfect and firm? I don't know what perfect is in energy. It needs to be improving. I think that's widely accepted standard. But if Washington State is now going to conduct itself in a trajectory that's amenable to stability over time, we should be listening to that, and not forget that the Pacific Northwest of the United States is very much directly connected to the fortunes of us. And as we see increases in AI, I mean, that's been one of the big stories globally in energy of 2024. Suddenly, if we thought we were in a comfortable place for the supply of electricity, we're not in that place anymore. And wouldn't it be smart to adapt our policies to emerging reality? AI is just one part of that. There's a lot of other factors, electric vehicles, obviously part of that. That's a whole other discussion. Barry, I just want to hand the mic back to you, but I think that the last thing I'd say is that after this call, because we're very concerned about the city of Vancouver, November 26th, there's some public input opportunities for those on the call who've got residency or business interests or some standing with which to share their views to the city of Vancouver. We'll provide a few suggestions in case you're wondering how you might do that in the formats that civic government supplies. It's probably never been more important to do that if you are amongst the energy crowd that's paying attention and cares, is concerned about this. Your voice matters. It's just like your vote matters. This matters too. So as I say, we'll supply that. Barry, back to you.
Yeah, Stuart, just to go back on the affordability and housing question. I think you had mentioned to me that you'd seen a letter from an electrical contractor and an engineering firm indicating that, in the past in Vancouver, you could expect your budget would be maybe $500,000 to $1 million for doing the electrical hookup work with BC Hydro. But with higher demand for electricity in the buildings, if natural gas is not permitted for a heating source, they're seeing budgets go from $500,000 to $1 million, maybe $4 to $10 million for getting new buildings, maybe they're apartment buildings or office towers, I'm not sure which, but getting those connected. Can you kind of discuss some of that, what you've come across?
Yes, and those in the building trades and construction on the call will be all too familiar with this. I think there's been an impression that perhaps some interests have sought to plant with the public that, oh, it's just simple. There's no issues with this. We'll just simply go from the source of energy that supplies 2/3 of our energy on the coldest day to the one that has supplied 1/3, and we'll just move the 1/3 to the whole pie. We'll get it all from electricity. Well, it doesn't sound easy when put that way, but we're told it's easy. But yet, for those building housing, they have these requirements. The complexity of the grid comes into it. I mean, we're certainly aware of some good investments and promises being made by BC Hydro to address the transmission issues that affect the cost of hookups. It's on a monumental scale, however, when you look at what Clean BC entails, and that ties back to a whole other thing that we haven't really brought in here, Barry, which is the economic impact of the stack of policies. And we're probably talking 20 or 25 different policies that are stacked up to make up Clean BC, and each one of them has its impact on the stack. So in the case of housing, you are going to see this multiplied over every project at a time when the public has been led to expect that government is doing something about affordability of housing. And we've seen it in Richmond. I think there's very grave concerns out there. I guess those houses will get built in other municipalities, but I don't think that's really how you want to do things. So maybe there are questions that come up from the audience. They're starting to stack up, and thanks folks who are contributing to that. We'll be shifting over to those great questions in a minute. But those are my thoughts, Barry.
Right, and we because of concerns around time. There's many other tangents we could have gone into, looking at what are the options for renewable natural gas, for example, which is a growing sector in British Columbia. And are there other options for using those pipes if they're constructed going into buildings? in order to move energy. But if they're not built in the first instance, then you don't have that option going forward to use other energy forms, such as renewable natural gas or potentially other gaseous forms of heating that will be lower carbon in the future. So it's kind of important to get that infrastructure. And then around the challenge of building electricity and expanding the system, I keep talking about this over and over again. It's not just the cost, it's the time. And it takes a long time to get things built and implemented in British Columbia and in other provinces too, in other countries, but particularly here for a variety of reasons. So many of these changes can possibly occur, but it's the pace that just at the moment looks impractical given the existing constraints already, the concerns around affordability, the need to build more housing and do it quickly and do it yesterday. So just all of these factors have to be kept in mind, but one of the underlying themes is pace. We need a bit more time to get some of these things right.
Let's move to the Q&A. We have some excellent questions. By the way, a little bit of news as we sit here. I'm just seeing that there are reports that it's going to take a little while longer than maybe some were thinking for the mandate letters from the new provincial government, the David Eby, BC NDP government to come out. We're seeing reports in this hour on the challenges in this political composition. So maybe that means there's time to be talking about these things in a way that will be heard in terms of those important policy steps. Let's get into the questions here. Barry, are you ready?
Yes.
Barry's ready. Okay, here we go. I have a great question. Many have claimed that electric heat pumps are much cheaper over their life cycle. They're also claiming the capital costs are the same. I guess the same as a furnace, a gas furnace. City of Richmond and others, this has been cited. Barry, what are your thoughts about this claim that electric heat pumps are much cheaper over their life cycle than natural gas heat?
Well, they may be for the individual user, but the question is, how do you overcome that initial capital cost? And then how do you supply the electricity? If BC Hydro is saying it's going to take 9 months or 12 months to get around to connecting your building, that's going to delay the construction of the building and delay the opportunity for people to have that roof over their heads. So I would defer to experts in the field that actually install these heat pumps for a living, but I know that myself, it was a $14,000 commitment on my part after rebates to install a heat pump system for my house because I had only electric heat at that point and baseboard heating and wanted something more efficient. And yes, it is more efficient, but on the coldest days of the year, it's drawing a lot of electricity. There was a study done in looking at Kelowna. If 25% of the people there move from natural gas heating to electric heat pumps, then on the coldest day of the year, you would expect an increase in electricity consumption within the boundaries of Kelowna of 50%. So that's 50% added to what's already the peak day. So a very daunting challenge. Of course, Kelowna gets colder temperatures in the winter than we do on the lower mainland or in Vancouver, but it just illustrates the fact that the colder it gets, the more electricity the heat pump requires to try and keep you comfortable.
Yep. I just want to dig into this a little layer down because frequently we see these claims made. Barry, you recently presented to the City of Richmond at a hearing on this topic. You spend a lot of time on these issues, and I must say your preparation is as meticulous as it gets. I've learned a lot from your approach, and you've brought the facts to all of these discussions. But sometimes it seems as if the facts aren't persuasive enough. What's the way to be persuasive? And I'm thinking really of what we can give to the audience, because there might be some people here who are looking for that. How can we be more persuasive with these facts and arguments?
Well, often I sat through the several hours of Richmond Council struggling for, I think, the third time this year on this topic, using up a lot of their time. talking about energy policy. I think facts are important, but often what seems to win the day is emotion. So many of the presenters arguing that we need to go faster, are quite emotional about it, and nobody disputes that it would be nice if we could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions dramatically. But as we've seen, it takes a huge, it can have a big impact on the economy. Look at what happened during COVID. That's the last time, and really the only time, we had a significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions in British Columbia and elsewhere. It's when economic activity was kind of ground to a halt, because we weren't traveling or going to work physically, as much as we were before. And now that the COVID crisis has receded and people have tried to return back to normal, our greenhouse gas emissions have more than recovered. They're actually going back up again, higher than they were prior to COVID. So it just illustrates you have to be careful, uh, weighing your emotional response to what would the impact be to the other things that we could also get very emotional about, such as, do we have a reliable healthcare system? Hospitals require electricity and heating for all of the care that they give us. Uh, Similarly with our schools. So there are other emotional arguments that can be made to having the importance of a functioning economy. And the economy does ultimately depend on energy. We need to try to make that cleaner and greener over time, but it does take time to do this in a measured way that achieves the outcome and addresses that trilemma: reliability, affordability, and sustainability. We try to get all three right.
So Barry, I wouldn't be surprised if on November 26th, when Vancouver City Council is deliberating on this issue, there's going to be organizations that bring school children out to gather outside City Hall and provide emotional displays of their concerns, real concerns over the future of climate, and connect those concerns to this issue. That's some powerful emotional payload that is being planned to, I think, try to shift the thinking on this. But when you look at the assemblage of facts here, how does one come to these arguments when you're faced with that sort of pure emotion rather than rational discussion?
Well, that's a challenge, and as you can see, I try to get the facts on the table. Maybe others will have a more persuasive way of presenting those facts, but I think it's always important to be grounded in factual information, and just to be persistent, I guess, in communicating that. I've seen some of the questions coming through, such as, what would the demand be over 20 to 50 years? Is anybody looking out that far? Well, yes, although we don't hear a lot about it. We're seeing projections, including from the BC government in their document I referenced earlier. It came out in June of this year, about 2 to 3 times as much electricity required by 2050 in order to try and achieve some of these targets. And other analysts think that that's low. So the thought of doubling or tripling our current electrical system in about 25 years, maybe 25 years sounds like a long time, but it's taken us 100 years to build what we have today without the same kind of restrictions on land use, without the need to engage with First Nations, which we should. But in the past, we didn't. And we didn't concern ourselves so much about endangered species and fish habitat. And yet it took us 100 years to build what we have today. The idea that we're going to double or triple it in a quarter of that time, given our current concerns about these very important topics, really stretches credibility in my mind. But yes,
Yep.
I saw a question about what
Yes,
does
and
it look like
we've got
going
the
out?
questions.
It would be huge.
The questions are stacking up. I want to make sure at the end of this call I can say everyone's question has gotten asked. So let's race through it here. Does UBCM have an official position on this topic, natural gas bans?
UBCM?
Union of BC Municipalities.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Do you think there's any possibility for the changes to the BC building code that are scheduled for March 2025 to be delayed or modified on the energy efficiency side? Is this is this a message that anyone is bringing to the provincial government?
I think the message is there. Is the government going to act on it is another question. Uh, it was a very close call in the election we just had. It couldn't have been any closer, really. And Premier Eby says he's listening and he's hearing what people are saying. Um, and I'm not saying most voters were even thinking of this topic, but I think the overall gist is that British Columbians are feeling concerned about their economic status and what's going to happen in the future. And underpinning all that is affordability, concerns about affordability. So um, I think there is an opportunity for the government to act if they want to.
Okay. I just want to mention Bill Thielman has weighed in to say that he has got a suggestion from his organization, the BC Coalition for Affordable Dependable Energy. That's BCCADE, BC CADE. And Bill says, I want to encourage webinar participants today to send Vancouver City Council members a message supporting the motion ending the effective ban on renewable natural gas and natural gas. And by the way, that's a good point. The City Council has banned renewable natural gas. Go figure. But to weigh in on that before the November 26th council debate, here's what you do, says Bill. More information at www.bccade.ca, bccade.ca. You don't need to write it down. We're going to put that in the email follow-up and some other stuff. So thanks, Bill Thielman, for that. I'm just going to go to a question. We have the question, what are the best ways to keep BC Hydro accountable for their promises and plans? Because we've heard a lot of promises and plans of late. Barry.
Well, I guess it's through sessions like this. I encourage people to visit our website, Energy Futures website, take a look at it. We try to keep up to date with current information and, again, factual. There are other people doing work in this space. I referenced earlier Richard Mason. He's got an interesting blog called Just and Reasonable. He's a former BC Utilities Commissioner. And he's trying to keep, I guess, Utilities Commission accountable for approving every single reconsideration request in the last year that BC Hydro's asked for. And he's posed the question, is BC Hydro getting special treatment, getting their way compared to other utilities? And I think the inference is yes. So there are potential accountability mechanisms, such as the Utilities Commission, but in the past year or so, BC Hydro seems to be getting their way with the Utilities Commission, according to Richard Mason, who's a former commissioner.
Right. Here's a question. Where are all of the quote unquote clean electrons supposed to come from? Our contributor, Colin Smith, thank you, read yesterday that Montana will be continuing operation of its coal plants to supply power to data centers. And let me interject that I was hoping I'd be able to get my favorite new German word in sometime in this call, Dunkelflaut. That's a wind drought. But they've had that in Northern Europe for maybe not today, but over the last 10 days. I think there's 6 consecutive days of no wind, which has sent the prices of electricity skyrocketing, and reminding that if you don't have that clean, firm power, that's what happens. So that's the question. Where are all these clean electrons going to come from for British Columbia, Barry?
Well, that's a good question. Another question is, well, what kind of electrons have we been importing? We've imported, in the last year, 25%, well, 24.5% of what we've consumed has come from outside of our borders. And the government may say, well, so there's excess solar in the afternoon in California. Okay. But we've been importing equal amounts at nighttime. And it isn't that sunny usually at nighttime. So we don't know with specificity where these electrons are originating. But overall in the United States, 60% of their electricity comes from fossil fuel generation, coal and natural gas. And in Alberta, it's around 75% annually. And we've been predominantly importing from the United States, but also from Alberta. So a significant number of those electrons are coming from fossil fuel generation, while at the same time, we're saying we shouldn't be using that in British Columbia. And that's what I mean about just focusing on what happens within our boundaries. The atmosphere doesn't really care from a climate change perspective where those emissions come from. And we're doing a bit of an accounting game when we don't count the GHGs associated with the imported electricity. And we only look at what's happening in our province. and not
Right.
counting what we're importing to make it happen.
Yeah.
Um,
Is this like vacation calories? Like if you go to France, those calories don't count? Or,
I think maybe it is.
okay.
There was a question about um, the federal regulations to trying to get to electricity regulations to phase out fossil fuel use, and what would that do to BC? It's often not known that in British Columbia we still have about 400 megawatts of natural gas electricity generation, but under Clean BC policies and also I guess the federal regulations, that's supposed to come to an end in BC sooner because of the Clean BC policies. This summer, BC Hydro was relying on a plant on Vancouver Island and Campbell River called Island Generation for 275 megawatts of production, basically full tilt all summer. They'll fill the gap and still importing on top of that. But under Clean BC, we won't have that available to us in the future. And that's one of the reasons that that national organization or North American organization I mentioned earlier said we're at risk for maintaining reliability standards. They identified that plan to reduce these 400, eliminate 400 megawatts of natural gas dispatchable electricity as putting us at risk. Because
Yeah.
unlike wind, as you mentioned, natural gas, you can turn it on when you need it to generate the electricity. With wind, you have to hope the weather cooperates. And that German term you just used, I think it also refers to cloudiness. So in Germany, what they had recently is not just a lack of wind, but it was cloudy. So their solar panels were significantly reduced in their output. So they lost both solar output and wind. And as a result, they had to fire up their old coal-fired power plants to make up the difference.
Right. Recently, we saw a headline, and we discussed this story this week, Barry. The Norwegians were a couple of years ago faced with this type of situation, no more gas, all reliant on renewables, actually telling institutions, industrial customers that they couldn't use electricity or must use less at certain times, which is a reality. I don't know if they've solved it in a better way than that, than rationing, but it proves that in a country with a standard of living and economic system just like ours, that can happen. It's not this wild hypothetical thing that only happens in the developing world. Moving on. Metrovan's draft liquid waste management plan devotes 3 of its 20 strategies to beneficial use of resources in wastewater, including the production of biogas. And I think you could take that and run with it. Let me add, I think I was reading, it might have been in the Globe and Mail this morning, someone saying, if we're investing in renewable gas as a way to prevent methane from escaping into the atmosphere, because there's a lot of people saying right now that methane escaping into the atmosphere is a bigger climate problem than some other things. Would it make sense to encourage RNG production, but also its use? But if we're going to forbid its use, which is happening in Vancouver and Richmond, they're saying, no, you can't use any gas, renewable, hydrogen. We don't care if it's low or zero carbon. We just don't like gas. What say you, Barry, to the Metro van? They seem to be progressive. They want to use biogas, but then others don't want to use biogas. What's going on?
It feels a little bit like the left hand and the right hand not knowing what each other's doing. Uh, in April, I
Well,
had
that's
a
an
tour,
improvement on the one hand clapping, but not much of one.
obviously working in kind of in opposite directions. I had an energy tour in Denmark in April, and they're putting a lot of focus on what they call biogas, or we would call renewable natural gas. And saw a number of facilities that are, a key part of their energy system, and feeding in biogas into their home heating and commercial heating pipelines into the network. And so they're investing a lot of money to make that a real feasible option for them, and they're doing it right now. It's happening. I live in the Fraser Valley, and the agricultural sector has a strong interest in being a part of renewable natural gas because, frankly, it provides them an extra revenue stream, and it can reduce complaints from neighbors about the smell that farming inevitably brings with it. If we can find a way, and we do have a way currently, to take manure, excess manure, and other organic products and put them into a digester and separate the methane and use it for heating and get into a distribution network. But you only have that distribution network if you build it in the first place.
Um, we're seeing more questions come in. Good, keep them coming, but we will have to race to get to the end so I can fulfill my promise to ignore nobody. How do we meet global climate targets while relying on fossil fuel energy? The question is, what do you think is more effective? Investment in areas like carbon capture, hydrogen, biomethane, versus increased investment in electricity production and transmission? Barry?
It's going to sound like a political answer. It's not meant to be, but we probably need to do all of it. The question, I guess, is how much and scale and balancing, but we need an all of the above approach, really. One of the things that gets overlooked in the talk about the transition, I was on CBC radio yesterday and responding to a report from some environmental group saying, oh, the world's not going to want natural gas from BC, when in fact, China and others are looking to increase natural gas consumption by 70%, 70% in the next 10 years to try and reduce the growth of coal. So coal use is still growing in Asia because they don't have readily available alternatives. So what that term transition maybe overlooks is that it's actually an addition. The world as a whole is using more energy, not less. Now we can try and change the composition of that energy, and we always should try to be more efficient in the use of that energy. But the big picture story is as the world population grows and economies, people want to, enter the economy and improve their standard of living. That typically means more energy use, not less. So it's maybe not completely incorrect to think about a transition, but it's important to think probably it's also an addition. So in the United States, despite under the Biden administration, billions and billions of dollars of subsidies and incentives and more wind power and solar power coming online, this past summer, they used more natural gas than ever before for their electrical system. In July, they hit a new peak use of natural gas for electricity generation because demand is growing that quickly. And during the hot weather, the wind stopped. And so they had this similar situation what Germany just experienced. They had to rely on fossil fuel to get them through that peak period.
Um, Someone asked, will this presentation be sent to every BCMLA? I think this raises the bigger question of education. We have I believe a majority of the MLAs incoming are new to those roles. So education for these caucuses is going to be super important. I think there's too many other questions to delve into that, but quick answer is yes, we will get information to all of the MLAs. And thanks for asking that. No need to weigh in, Barry, because we've got so many other things I need to get you on.
Yeah. A different question. A different question. Somebody asked, will we put out a full suite of recommendations or policy proposals?
Yes.
The answer is yes, we did. It's on our website, energyfutures.ca, I believe. And it's the main thing that opens up. It's our policy recommendations released, I think, on July 18th. And you can take a look at them there. There's 10 major topics that we cover off in our recommendations.
Yeah. Energyfuturesinstitute.ca. You'll find that. But to Martin's point, I think there's always more work to be done there. And I would say, yes, we are committed to continuing to amplify and explore beyond this. Question here, provincial ban on cryptocurrency mining. Will this ban help with affordability or will it not make a difference?
Well, the BC Hydro is facing a challenge. They couldn't meet safely the demands, the request for hookups. One particular proposal wanted 200 or 250 megawatts. BC Hydro contacted the government. The government passed an order in council and then I think legislation later to say no. We're not going to connect these types of facilities because effectively we're rationing electricity. I mentioned earlier the government's acknowledged a queue of 7,000 megawatts waiting for service. We're effectively now already into the position where government's picking winners and choosers, winners and losers in the economy because we just don't have enough to go around for
everything
everyone
has
that
to go
wants it.
perfectly for that to happen, just like Site C's experience as well. Question, consumers have, it's said, been asked to put both heat pumps and furnaces into their homes. I think this is a reference maybe to dual fuel systems, a heat pump and a furnace. Comment on that, Barry? Quick comment, because we got a few other things we got to race through.
Yeah, one of the options with heat pumps, because of their challenge during very cold weather, is to have a hybrid system or a dual fuel for natural gas, but then you're going to have to permit natural gas to be used. And under the most stringent version of the zero carbon step code, some of the installers say it just does not become practical or even possible
Right.
to meet the requirements and to
Okay.
give you a
Yeah.
dual fuel option.
Backup power plants at the household or institutional level, hospitals, SkyTrain. Is that a thing?
Yes, hospitals do have backup generators, and our understanding is that they do run in British Columbia, Lower Mainland, but it's not widely advertised um, for political reasons. It's not talked about. But yes, backup generation is a thing, and it is already being used at times.
Okay, so BC's got its Clean BC, and then you've got ECCC, the Environment Canada, Clean Energy Regulations, and when they come into the fact, they also require GHG reductions. Um, it is confusing. Is there even one person in existence who could actually stand up and explain all of these policies, how they work together, federal, provincial, different departments, different things? Are we
I'm
overregulated, perhaps? Are we just confused?
uh, there is overlapping jurisdiction being claimed by the provinces and the federal government. Welcome to Canada and our constitutional makeup. But traditionally, provinces have been responsible for natural resources and for things like air permitting, air regulations, air emissions. Those permits are issued provincially, but increasingly the federal government's trying to get in this space as well and argue that they have some constitutional authority also. So we do have, yes, some overlapping pancaking situations, and
Yeah.
it gets hard to explain.
We're coming down to the finish line here. I'll tell you, there's a number of these questions, and we can access these questions after, and we'll go in and mine them for ideas. There's some good ideas, like is there a list of key individual influencers that we could suggest on this topic? I could name 100, but we can't do it right now, nor can you, Barry. I'm just going to park that one, but we'll come back to it in other work later. Barry, what's your sense of the risk and priorities of the BC Greens in their negotiations with the NDP? Just quickly, please, related to energy, Clean BC right now?
That's a very open question, but I'm not privy. The Premier did acknowledge this week that discussions are ongoing with the Greens. So despite the government having a one-seat majority, it's clear they're not that comfortable about being able to operate the legislature. So it looks like they're still trying to secure support, maybe on a longer-term basis from the Greens. One of the Green MLAs had said during the campaign he'd still like get the government to cancel the wood fiber LNG project, even though it's well underway in terms of construction.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
we'll see what comes out of those talks.
Yeah, Barry, I noticed this morning there's a news report on Taiwan. They want to increase their LNG supply. And when you look closely, what they want to do is increase the storage they have up to 27 days of gas to run the country. Now, why would a country that's being circled by warships from China want to have a goodly supply of LNG on hand in its stores? I wonder. Let's not go into that. But I want to ask this excellent question here. How can we, the energy sector, those on the call from that sector, and those who work in that space, more effectively communicate the crisis we're in? I mean, I think that's a good word to use. Thank you, questioner, for that, particularly to communicate to NDP voters in the cities who are served up a lot of information that doesn't pass our litmus test for validity. Barry, that's our last question. Please do it quickly before the minute's out.
Talk to your neighbors, talk to your employees if you have any, talk to your significant others, and use social media. You can retweet, repost, Facebook, X, whatever is happening,
Okay.
Instagram. And we put out content at Energy Futures. I know you do too, Stuart, at Resource Works, and others do.
Okay.
Share the information.
All right, good. I'm just going to remind you, bck.ca. That's something you can do right now if you're feeling emboldened. And then there'll be some information coming your way, and it'll be in writing for you. So it's time to go. You've got things to do. Thank you all for being part of our latest town hall at Energy Futures, and we look forward to next time. Bye now.